So, Shalom Aleichem. We continue where we left off, last week, but we will recap also what we said, so those who are not here will be able to follow. We are discussing the question of wearing Tefillin on HaMoed. This is an important question in and of itself, of course. Tefillin being a very important mitzvah, it's necessary to know whether one should or whether one must wear Tefillin on HaMoed, or whether one does not need to, or whether one may if one wishes to, or whether it's asur to do so. We have the whole range of opinions on this matter, as on other matters. We saw certain sources last week, and we'll see some more sources this week. So this week, let's begin and recap a bit by reading from the Tur. The Tur writes in Hayim Siman Lamed Aleph. He says, first of all, Shabbat wa Yom Tov lau zaman tefillin hen. Shabbat and Yom Tov are not days when we wear tefillin. And regarding Holosh al-Mo'ed, says the Tur, Holosh al-Mo'ed yesh mistapkim bo. There are those who have a doubt whether one is supposed to wear tefillin on HaMoed. Imhu zman tefillin or minahim othan imhu zman tefillin. And therefore, what they do, those people who are not sure, minahim othan belo bracha. This is really interesting what the Torah says. A lot of people read this sentence without actually catching what the Torah says. The Torah does not say there's a mahloketh about wearing tefillin on HaMoed. Some say you do and some say you don't, which happens to be the fact. But that's not what the Torah says. The Torah says there are those who are not sure. Yesh mistapkim bo. There are those who have a doubt whether you are supposed to wear tefillin on HaMoed, and therefore those people menehim otham belo bracha. And therefore there are those people who wear tefillin without saying a bracha on HaMoed, which eventually became the more or less standard practice amongst Ashkenazim in the fullness of time. It says, I read again. V'holo shel mo'ed yesh mistapekim bo im hu zaman tefillin u'minihim otham belo bracha. And therefore what they do, those mistapkim, wear it without saying a bracha. And then he continues in the last sentence of this seif, of this siman, which is very brief. V'adoni avi harosh za, my father the rosh, haya meniham u'mevarech alehem. He wore them and he said a bracha. And that's how he leaves it. So the Torah is obviously clearly of the opinion, usually, although not absolutely, this is not an absolute hard and fast rule, there are exceptions, but 95% of the time the Torah goes along with the opinion of his father the Rosh. And here also it seems very clear that's his view, and that one should wear tefillin, one should make a bracha. The point I was trying to stress was that the Torah does not actually say there are those who say you don't wear it at all. He doesn't actually say such a thing, although there are in fact such views. It's interesting to note that he didn't mention them, but that's the fact. This would apparently indicate that the Torah thought at very best you could perhaps raise a question mark, but you really couldn't prove with any certainty, based on any kind of Talmudic proof, that one should not wear tefillin on HaMoed. And here I repeat what I said last week. There is no statement, no explicit statement that says in so many words anywhere in Chazal, in any of the literature of the Tanaim or the Amoraim, there is no statement that says one wears tefillin on HaMoed, or one must wear tefillin on HaMoed. And similarly, there is no explicit statement that says, in no uncertain terms, one does not, or one may not wear tefillin on HaMoed. So the question is, what can be understood from different sources that somehow relate to this matter? What can one understand? What can one extrapolate from those sources and infer from those sources? And that's what all the different poskim, at least for the most part, are doing. It seems from the wording of the Torah that he felt there was really no basis at all to claim that one should not wear tefillin on Chol HaMoed. At the most, you could claim perhaps that one's not sure. That's the point I'm making here, because that's what the Torah actually writes. The Beth Yosef, again, we're recapping a bit. The Beth Yosef starts by quoting the Tosafot. The Tosafot in Masechet Menachot Daf Lamed Waw Amud Beth write regarding the statement in the Gemara over there that one does not wear tefillin on Shabbat and Yom Tov. The Tosafot suggest as follows: Lo mishum de'asireh be'asiyat melacha. It is not because these days, Shabbat and Yom Tov, are days when one cannot do melacha min Torah. De'afilu Chol HaMoed de'shareh be'asiyat melacha ika oth befesach de'asur b'achilat chametz u'b'sukkot de'hayav b'sukkah. So the Tosafot suggest, either they're stating that it's definitely so, or they're suggesting that it's possibly so. Even that's not entirely clear from the Lashon of the Tosafot. That either it's certainly not because these days are asur b'melacha, but it's for another reason, or one might claim that it's not for that reason, but for another reason. In other words, if we understand that the reason one does not wear tefillin on Shabbat and Yom Tov, as stated by Rabbi Akiva in the Braita that we saw last week, where the pasuk says that the tefillin will be an oath that you wear daily to remind you of Yetziat Mitzrayim, and Rabbi Akiva says Yas'u elu shehen gufan oath. These days themselves are called an oath, because we see in the Torah it says mufrash ki oath hi beni uvenechem. Right? Shabbat, etc. Ki othi b'ni uvenechem. The Shabbat is called an oath. It doesn't say anything explicitly in those terms. It doesn't mention Yom Tov in the same context or use that term. But the different Rishonim explain that Yom Tov, as the Reed, for instance, writes, that Yom Tov is always compared to Shabbat, except for those very specific things where it's different. But as a rule, Shabbat and Yom Tov have the same halachic status, certainly when it comes to melacha, and therefore they can also be considered an oath. Also keep in mind, and this is based on other perush that appears in the Rishonim, that all the Hagim and Shabbat also are all referred to as being a zecher l'Yetziat Mitzrayim. And this is what we say in the Nusach of the Tefillah. So when the Torah says this thing, Yetziat Mitzrayim, will be an oath, will be a reminder. An oath is a sign, something that reminds you. This is something you shall wear to remind you of Yetziat Mitzrayim on a daily basis. It follows that on a day which itself is a special day, which is designed to remind you of Yetziat Mitzrayim and be a remembrance of that fact and to commemorate that fact, that you have an oath already in that day itself. So the question is, however, is it called an oath because of the isur of melacha, or is it called an oath for another reason? So the Tosafot say Holo Shel Moed is also called an oath, even though Minat Torah, at least this is the opinion of the Tosafot. This Tosafot here in Menachot at least holds this, that Hol HaMoed is mutar b'melacha Minat Torah. The one may do melacha on Hol HaMoed Minat Torah, and the isur of doing certain kinds of melacha on Hol HaMoed is midrabanan. But there is an oath on these days, namely that Chol HaMoed Pesach you may not eat hametz and you eat matzah instead, and all the days of Sukkot you have to live in a sukkah. And I mentioned these words of the Tosafot last time, and I asked the following question, if you recall, that if we take the Tosafot as it's written before us, it seems that one can ask a very serious kushya on what they're saying. Namely, what about days when you don't have, in other words, if the Tosafot mean to say it has nothing to do with the isur of melacha, it has to do with something else, namely hametz and masa or sukkah, then I pointed out it doesn't explain to us why one should not wear tefillin on Shavuot Or, as was pointed out by someone else on Shmini Asereth, when there's no mitzvah to live in a sukkah either, right? And no one seems to be suggesting that. So, what exactly are the Tosafot saying? It occurred to me after last week's Shiur that perhaps one has to understand the Tosafot a little bit differently. Maybe what the Tosafot mean to say is, certainly it's the case that a day which is Asur b'Melacha is called an off, and therefore that day you are patur from wearing tefillin. That's definitely the case. But even days which are not Asur b'Melacha min HaTorah, there is something else special about those days, namely Chol HaMoed Pesach and Chol HaMoed Sukkot. There are other days which are special days where there is something that can be regarded as an oath, a reminder of Yetziat Mitzrayim, namely Masah and Sukkah, and it's a fact that both these mitzvot have a clear connection to Yetziat Mitzrayim. Right? It says in the Torah that we are commanded to live in a Sukkah for 7 days. Kivu Sukkot Hoshavti et Bnei Yisrael, etc. When they left Mitzrayim, right? That we dwelt in Sukkot in the desert. And Masah is obviously connected to Yetziat Mitzrayim. So maybe that's what the Tosafot mean, even though it doesn't say so in as many words in the Tosafot. But it's very possible, and seems even likely to me, that this is what the Tosafot said, in which case the kushya that I asked last week is no longer a kushya. I did search a little bit, not exhaustively perhaps, but I did search in different places to see if someone wrote something about this Tosafot and suggested what I just said now. I haven't yet found such a thing. It may be somewhere, and I may yet find it. But at any rate, regarding what the Tosafot say, it seems to me likely that's what the Tosafot had in mind. Therefore, it would not therefore be correct to claim that Tosafot one can claim that Tosafot are suggesting that one does not wear tefillin, or that one should wear tefillin rather on Shavuot or on Shmini Asereth, which is something which of course we've never heard of and no one's ever suggested. The Beth Yosef goes on to continues to quote from the Tosafot, who quote the Sugya Moed Katan, which we're going to look at shortly. And the Tosafot suggests that perhaps from there one can find proof, as we will see shortly. One can see proof both in the Bavli and the Yerushalmi in that Sugya in Moed Katan that one does wear tefillin on Chol HaMoed. Then the Beit Yosef goes on to quote from the Rosh. We also looked at the Rosh last week. The opinion of the Rosh is quite emphatic that one certainly should wear tefillin on Chol HaMoed. He's even more emphatic in a Teshuvah, in one of his Teshuvot, where he writes about this. And the Mordechai is also quoted by the Beit Yosef, the Mordechai also being an important Rishon from Ashkenaz, from Germany. The Mordechai is quoted as saying as follows: Katav b'shem Hari, apparently it's a reference to Rabbeinu Yitzchak Baal Tosafot, D'nir'eh ra'aya gemura min HaYerushalmi d'Chol HaMoed hayav b'tefillin. This is, if it's a reference to that Rabbeinu Yitzchak Baal Tosafot, that's a bit strange, because he's mentioned, as I'll read to you in a moment, in other places as having this particular Chacham as having said the opposite. So maybe it's Rabbi Yehuda, it's another Chacham with the same initial. It's not clear. But at least we understand from the Mordechai that a Chacham of stature mentioned or thought that the Yerushalmi was clear proof that one should wear tefillin on Chol HaMoed. We'll get to that Yerushalmi presently. He also quotes, the Mordechai quotes from the Smak, Sefer Miswot Katan, and also the Sefer Teruma, Deyesh laniach belo bracha. This is exactly what the Tur was referring to. But there are those who say, seeing that we know there's a difference of opinion on this matter, one should wear tefillin without a bracha. But then the Mordechai continues, he was a Talmid of Marami Rothenburg, and he says, Mi'u Maharam hayam avarech alehim. He wore them, made a bracha, which is what the Rosh also said. And the Rosh was also a Talmid of the Marami Rothenburg. And then to round out this discussion, before he adds a few words of his own, the Beth Yosef mentions a teshuvah of the Rashba, who says, She'en menihim tefillin b'chol HaMoed. The Rashba, who's from Spain, and I think this is interesting, the more we begin to dig into this subject, the more you will see that there seems to be some kind of a Sfaradi Bavli connection to this view of not wearing tefillin b'chol HaMoed. The Rashba, who's from Sfarad, says, En menihim tefillin b'chol HaMoed. V'chen da'at HaTosafot v'Ra'avad Zal. This is also said in the name of the Ra'avad. The Rashba says the Ra'avad was of this view. He also mentioned the Tosafot. This is the Tosafot that we saw in Menachoth. V'chen anu nohachim. What does the Rashba actually say? The Rashba in his Teshuvah says that the oath, seeing that Rabbi Akiva says the days which are themselves an oath, a sign, a reminder, Yetziat Mitzrayim, do not require tefillin. The Rashba says that we have an Isur of Melacha on Chol HaMoed as well, and the opinion of the Rashba is that this Isur is an Isur Torah. In other words, those things that one is not allowed to do on Chol HaMoed, one is not allowed to do the Minat Torah. There is such a view. There are other Rishonim who hold this as well. And the Rashba says, therefore, seeing that there is a certain Isur Melacha, even though it's not on the same level as the Isur Melacha of doing Melacha on Shabbat and Yom Tov, nevertheless, there is an Isur Melacha on Chol HaMoed Minat Torah, and that is the oath. So therefore, just as Shabbat and Yom Tov are an oath because of the Isur Melacha, the same also applies to Chol HaMoed. So says the Rashba. That's the Rashba's logic. In other words, the Rashba doesn't bring any other proof, because there is no other proof. There is no other sugya or any other statement in Chazal, as I said before, that actually says one should not wear tefillin b'chol HaMoed. But several Rishonim, like the Rashba, do say, seeing that the Isur Melacha on Chol HaMoed is Minat Torah, that's also an oath. It's considered an oath, just like Shabbat and Yom Tov are considered an oath. The fact there's a difference in the level of Isur Melacha is not so critical, because there's also a difference in the level of Isur Melacha between Shabbat and Yom Tov. The Radbaz, in a Teshuvah, the Radbaz is Rabbi David ben Zimra, who lived the same generation as the Beth Yosef. He was a bit older than Beth Yosef, about 500 odd years ago. He was asked this question also, and he responds as follows. And this brings us to also, this is some background to the discussion about the influences of Kabbalistic thought and practice on general halachic practice of the masses. The Radbaz writes in a Teshuvah that he begins by saying that he saw that Mekubalim speak in very strong terms against wearing tefillin on Chol HaMoed. And then he says, as for halachic sources, there are different opinions. And he quotes the Rashba, this Teshuvah we just mentioned now, who, as we just said, the Rashba claims that, seeing that the Isur Melacha on Chol HaMoed is Minat Torah, therefore it's also an oath, and therefore you do not wear tefillin on Chol HaMoed. And the Radbaz says, from this I understand as follows, that if one holds that Isur Melacha on Chol HaMoed is Minat Torah, then one does not wear tefillin. If one holds that the Isur Melacha on Chol HaMoed is not Minat Torah, rather Midivrehem, Midirabanan, as for instance the Rambam writes, as the Radbaz himself mentions, as I will show you in a moment also, then one would have to wear tefillin on Chol HaMoed. And then the Radbaz sums up by saying, and this is one of the first indications we see that how significant the argument or the statements of the Mekubalim was in tilting the scales in this matter. He says, seeing that the whole issue is not entirely clear based on the usual Talmudic sources, therefore, and seeing that the Mekubalim are dead set against it, therefore, I suggest to you, this person who writes to the Radbaz, I suggest you do nothing. In other words, don't wear them. Shev al ta'aseh. That's what he writes. The Beth Yosef, who, as I say, lived around the same time as the Radbaz, writes here now as follows, and I quote: ועכשיו, נהגו כל בני ספרד שלא להניחם בחול המועד. The practice today that I see around me, and originally he was from Spain, the Beth Yosef, is that all the Jews in Sfarad do not wear tefillin on Chol HaMoed. He specifies Sefarad. In other words, he must have known. I'm sure he knew very well that many Jewish communities in other countries did wear tefillin on Chol HaMoed, such as in Germany and France and many other countries, Eastern Europe already, Poland and Russia. All the Jews were wearing tefillin at this time. We're talking here about 500 odd years ago. So he says the minhag now is that all the Sfaradim do not wear tefillin on Chol HaMoed. Shamati, and I have heard Shemikodem, that in the past, and there was a time that he himself had not experienced, some time before. Shemikodem hayu manihim otham b'chol HaMoed. I heard that in the past, even here in Sfarad, tefillin were worn, kedivrei harosh, as the Rosh writes. ואחר כך מצאו שכתב רבי שמעון בן בר יוחאי במאמר אחד שאסור להניחם. Then it was found in the Zohar, he means, which he goes on to quote in a moment, in a statement made by or attributed to Rabbi Shimon ben Bar Yochai, that it's asur to wear tefillin on Chol HaMoed. This is also, by the way, an interesting point, because amongst the Rishonim there is a discussion. Rishonim who knew nothing about the Zohar, there is a discussion of whether, even amongst those who say one should not wear tefillin on Chol HaMoed, there is a discussion whether one may not, it's asur to wear tefillin on Chol HaMoed, or simply is no requirement. If you want to, you may. But the same argument, by the way, applies also to Shabbat and Yom Tov. The very same discussion. There are those who say that you do not wear tefillin on Shabbat and Yom Tov, and if you do so, it's asur. You should not do so. It's asur. It's not like the greatest issur in the world, but it's you're not going to receive malkuyoth from Beth Din. You're not going to be lashed for doing so by Beth Din, not min Rabbanan, not min Torah. But it's improper to do so. And there are those who say it's just not required. But if you feel like putting them on, even on Shabbat, you may do so. There's no issur in doing so. The only problem with wearing tefillin on Shabbat, according to many Rishonim, is that you may, if you wear them, you may walk outside with them in the street, and then you may take them off on the street and carry them or something like that. So the chashash is because you may carry them, but beyond that, they don't see a problem in wearing tefillin even on Shabbat. But in this statement in the Zohar, it says quite explicitly in no uncertain terms that it's asur to wear tefillin on Chol HaMoed. V'chen katav mori dodi, and also my uncle here, the Beth Yosef quotes his uncle Rav Yitzhak Karo b'tshuva v'hama, and he also expressed this view that one should not wear tefillin on Chol HaMoed. And then he quotes the statement from the Zohar, which is to be found in the Zohar Hadash, Shir HaShirim, Daf Chet Amud Aleph, for those who wish to look it up. And it's a long quote. I'm not going to read the whole thing now, but I'll read just a few words. It says in the Zohar as follows: "Wa'ama kadisha ahidan tefillin v'sharia alayho b'yom tov u'v'cholo shel moed." That on Yom Tov and Cholo shel moed there is a special kedusha that Am Yisrael is connected to. Wa'asila le'avarat tefillin demarei al ma' u'la'anahat tefillin aharonim. The Shabbat and Yom Tov are viewed, are understood according to this section in the Zohar Hadash on Shir HaShirim as being the reality, the existence of Shabbat is like wearing tefillin in itself. But it's tefillin that as where Hashem places on you. The kedusha of the day is like wearing tefillin, as opposed to placing the physical object known as tefillin on oneself on a regular day. And therefore it's asur, it says here in the Zohar Hadash, to, as it were, remove or show disrespect to the tefillin of Hashem that is on you because of the day of Shabbat and Yom Tov, and put on and wear other tefillin. The Beth Yosef ends, the last line of the Beth Yosef in this Siman, he says, "U'me'ahar shebetalmudah didan lo nitba'er din ze." Seeing that this halacha is not clear in our Talmud, as I say in the Talmud Bavli, whether that's true or not, we shall see. And it's also true, there's also a Talmud Yerushalmi that discusses that, which is perhaps even clearer. And that should also perhaps be taken into account. But the Beth Yosef says, seeing that the Talmud does not clarify this matter completely, Mi yi'rav libo lagesheth la'avor bekum asar divrei Rabbi Shimon ben Yochai, who will take upon himself to act in a manner opposite to that which is said by Rabbi Shimon ben Yochai, hamaflig kol kach be'isur hanachatan, who and I didn't read all the quote from the Zohar, but the Zohar is actually very extremely unambiguous and very adamant that one must not wear tefillin on HaMoed. Now it goes without saying that the Beth Yosef believed that the Zohar was written by Rabbi Shimon ben Yochai. It's also apparent from what the Beth Yosef writes, it's more than apparent, it's explicit, that he felt that this halacha is not clear from Chazal, from the Talmud, from the Mishnah and the Talmud, and therefore one must accept what it says in the Zohar, because he viewed this as being of something of very having tremendous authority and weight, and therefore Vadai one should not wear tefillin on HaMoed. This is the view of the Beth Yosef. In other words, it's written here in front of us, black and white, in the Beth Yosef, that he felt, and he was posek halacha l'maaseh, not to wear tefillin for two reasons on HaMoed, for two reasons. A, he was a Sfaradi, he came from Sfarad, and he already mentions that the minhag, the practice in Sfarad in his day was that everyone was wearing tefillin. That's number one. And I've mentioned in other shiurim that the Beth Yosef, to the best of my recollection anyhow, will never go against a minhag, a practice which is in force, which is on the ground, which is happening. He's not going to go against such a thing. And second of all, he says this din is murky and unclear in the Talmud, and therefore Vadai you have to follow what the Zohar says, because it's from Rashbi, from one of the Tanaim, and he says it's a Surah Tefillin HaMoed. So there's no doubt, not the slightest doubt in the world, that the view of the Beth Yosef is based in great part on the fact that in the Zohar it says not to wear tefillin on HaMoed. If, for example, this Zohar did not exist, or he had never heard of such a thing, it sounds it's not nearly as clear that he would have taken such a position. The same Beth Yosef in his Perush on the Rambam and Kesef Mishneh writes something similar. He actually writes it even a bit more clearly here. That's why I'm going to quote it to you from here. Hilchot Tefillin Perek Daled Halacha Yod. After discussing what the Rambam says or does not say on this subject, which we will look at again in a moment, the Kesef Mishneh writes, وَنَحْلَكُوا أَپُسِكِيم بَحَلُوش الْمُعِيد. Regarding Holosh al-Mo'ed, there is a mahloket of the Pusikim. Yesh mehem omrim de bichal Yom Tov him. There are those who say HaMoed is like Yom Tov, and just as you don't wear on Yom Tov, you don't wear on HaMoed. We'en menihim bahem tefillin. Weyesh omrim shemenihim, and there are those who say you do. Wechen yir'eh midivrei Rabbeinu, and he admits that so it seems from the Rambam. Both from what it says here in Hilchot Tefillin perhaps, but even more so from another halacha which we didn't mention last week, but we will mention now, presently. Another halacha, the Rambam writes in Hilchot Yom Tov, that a person may write Tefillin for himself on Yom Tov. Not Yom Tov, that's obviously not correct. I meant on Chol HaMoed. One can't write on Shabbat, nor on Chol HaMoed. But one may write, says the Mishnah, also says Rabbi Yehuda in the Mishnah, and that's the halacha, one may write Tefillin for oneself on Chol HaMoed. In other words, if one has not got tefillin, let's say they were lost or whatever happened to them. Then the Kesef Mishneh, the Beth Yosef in other words, writes, وَمِنْهَرْ هَعُلَمْ هَيَا لَهَنِحَمْ. The practice, now he says here, ha'olam, literally of the world, which is doesn't have to be taken entirely literally, but of every single last Jew in the world. But it does mean the general practice was, as far as he knew, the practice once was to wear tefillin on Chol HaMoed. Ad, until Shebiyamei Rabbanan Bathra'eh, literally until recent generations. It was found by some Chachamim. Mas'ul b'Sefer Hazar, they found written in the Sefer Hazar l'Shir HaShirim, Shemi shemeniach tefillin b'Chol HaMoed, kemi shekoses b'neti'ot u'nim na'umin l'anihan od b'Chol HaMoed. So, in recent generations, it was found in the Sefer Hazar on Shir HaShirim that it says not to wear tefillin. It's in fact definitely asur to do so, and then people start wearing tefillin. And that's how the minhag that he referred to earlier as being the minhag of Spain, of Sepharad, came about. This statement of the Kesef Mishneh is very instructive, because it states explicitly that the minhag everywhere was to wear tefillin on Chol HaMoed. In other words, that which he writes in the Beth Yosef, that the minhag in Sepharad, all Bnei Sepharad do not wear Chol HaMoed, in his day that was vadai true, but it was not true, shall we say, amongst the Ashkenazim. It wasn't true at all. All the Ashkenazim at that time were wearing tefillin on Chol HaMoed. But here he says even more, that even amongst the Sfaradim, because he's not referring to the Ashkenazim necessarily in this statement. In fact, it's more likely he's referring to the Sfaradim, because what he describes, it didn't happen in Ashkenaz, it happened in Sfarad, that it was discovered, or it became known at a certain point, some generations before his own time, that it said in the Sefer Hazar, this was discovered in Spain, not to wear tefillin on Chol HaMoed, and then people ceased wearing tefillin on Chol HaMoed. But he himself admits that even in Spain, at least many were wearing tefillin on Chol HaMoed, even though we saw that the Rashba says he did not wear tefillin on Chol HaMoed, and the Rashba was from Spain. But it seems that in Spain also there were different views and different opinions. And that's in fact probably why the Rashba was asked. Why was the Rashba asked in the first place whether you should or should not wear tefillin on Chol HaMoed? Because there was discussion about this, and it wasn't clear. Not everyone was doing exactly the same thing. If everyone knew that you do not wear tefillin on Chol HaMoed, then no one would have asked the Rashba, just as no one asked him whether you should wear tefillin on Shabbat. So this statement of the Kesef Mishneh, in other words, of Rabbi Yosef Karo, that that at some point before the Zohar became widely known, people were wearing tefillin on Chol HaMoed. This tells us, I think, something that we need to know and to keep in mind. We also saw in this statement in the Kesef Mishneh that he admits that from the Rambam it seems that one should wear tefillin on Chol HaMoed. At this point, I'll just remind you that the Beth Yosef writes in his Hakdamah to the Beit Yosef, to his Perush on the Tur, that because there are so many opinions and so many big Chachamim, he decided to choose 3 Chachamim whose works were known throughout the Jewish world and were readily available and were considered very great. Not the only ones who were very great, but they also wrote in a more or less systematic manner on most relevant halachot, at least those relevant was Man Galuth. And therefore, I'm going to take these 3, says the Beit Yosef, namely the Rif, the Rambam, and the Rosh, and I'll go with the majority of those 3. Well, the Beit Yosef just told us in his own words that the Rambam says that you do wear tefillin on Chol HaMoed, and the Rosh writes in his own words, in an entirely unambiguous manner, that one does wear tefillin and must wear tefillin on Chol HaMoed. That's already 2 out of 3. As for the Rif says very little, as is often his custom, but the fact is that there's no hint whatsoever in the Rif that would suggest that one does not wear tefillin on Chol HaMoed. He just quotes the statement we saw from Masechet Menachot, that one does not wear tefillin on Shabbat and Yom Tov. And we've already discussed, and perhaps we'll discuss some more later, or another Shiur. We've already mentioned that Yom Tov does not include Chol HaMoed. In fact, it never does. So there's really no basis whatsoever to claim that even one of the 3 holds that one wears tefillin on Chol HaMoed. So here we have another very instructive and illuminating example where the Beit Yosef is not following his own rule of thumb. Not by any means the only example, but it's an interesting example. In this particular case, the reason the Beth Yosef is ignoring his own rule without going by a majority of those three posekim, when in fact the majority, or in fact all three, really clearly say one does wear tefillin on Chol HaMoed. The reason the Beth Yosef deviates from his own rule on this matter is as follows. Because as I said, there was already a custom, there was already minhag b'makom, in action, on the ground, in his day in the Sepharad, and the aim of the Beth Yosef was to be posek halacha for the Jews that he knew and that he lived with and that he had grown up with, namely the Sfaradim. And amongst the Sephardim in his day, it was already accepted by all that you did not wear tefillin on Chol HaMoed. Second of all, because he claims that this halacha is unclear in the Talmudic sources, and the Zohar is entirely unambiguous on the matter, that one should not wear tefillin on Chol HaMoed. Therefore, one should not wear tefillin on Chol HaMoed. So the influence of the Zohar and the Kabbalah in this regard on the opinion of the Beth Yosef is not only an important factor, it's essentially the only factor. Because had he been following, if it had been another kind of halachic question, there was no minhag, shall we say, it wasn't clear what the minhag was amongst the Sfaradim, then he would have no reason, and there was no Zohar, shall we say, then he would have had absolutely no reason to say this. He would have then said, well, the Rambam and the Rosh definitely say you wear tefillin, the Rif probably does also, almost certainly does. Even though there are others who disagree, we should follow the Rif, the Rosh and the Rambam, and probably the Rif as well, and therefore we should follow this view and act accordingly. That's what the Beth Yosef does hundreds of times. But in this case, he doesn't do so, because there is already a minhag on the ground, and this minhag, by his own admission, came into being only because it was found written in Sefer Azar not to wear tefillin on Chol HaMoed. So it's entire. The minhag itself is a result of the Sefer Azar, and then he adds, and the Sefer Azar says, and it's really the same. It's the same reason. It's not two reasons. It's one reason. The Sefer Azar says X. This piece of information was discovered or became common knowledge in Spain sometime before the Beth Yosef, and then people, as a result, ceased wearing tefillin on Chol HaMoed. So by the time he writes this, in the early 1500s, it's already the accepted practice amongst the Sfaradim not to wear tefillin. Therefore, the Beth Yosef says you don't wear tefillin. Without the Zohar, there's no way that the Beth Yosef would have said such a thing. So the impact of the Kabbalah on this particular on the halachic practice, certainly of Sfaradi Jews at that time, is paramount. And the same we also saw, as I mentioned earlier, in the Tshuva of the Radbaz. The Radbaz also says, is machloket, whether it's malacha minat Torah, not minat Torah, we don't know. And the Zohar says very clear, and the Mekubalim say definitely no, so don't do it. In other words, sheval ta'aseh. Both these posekim are Sfaradim, both very great posekim, both of them are Sfaradim, and both of them are clearly saying what they're saying under the influence of the Zohar and the Mekubalim. Now, the question that we need to ask ourselves at this point is it in fact true, beyond the fact that we've just been told, we've been informed by the Beth Yosef that it was once the practice everyone was wearing tefillin on Chol HaMoed. And I mentioned it's a fact that amongst the Ashkenazim everyone, or just about everyone, was wearing tefillin. I wanted to quote something here also from the Hagoth Memoniot on this issue. Before we continue, the Hagoth Memoniot, which was written by another Talmid of Marami Rottenburg in Germany, on the Rambam in Perek Daled Halacha Yod, he writes as follows: Katav Rabbeinu Yehuda, that's Rabbeinu Yehuda Paris, one of the Balei Tosafot, שרבנו יצחק, that's the famous רבנו יצחק בעל התוספות, היה אוסר להניח תפילין בחול המועד, שרה יש בהן עוף בפסח מסות, בסוכות סוכה ולולב. So the first statement is that there are Chachamim in Tzorfat, in France, chiefly Ri Bala Tosafot, who says that one does not wear tefillin on Chol HaMoed. But then he goes on to say, Omnam Rabbeinu Shimshon, who's also from France, Katav sheyesh lani Chol HaMoed, he wrote that one should. This is the famous Rash Mishantz. V'chen Rabbeinu Baruch b'Sefer HaTruma, that's also the view of Rabbeinu Baruch, another Baal Tosafot. V'chen Rabbeinu Simcha, another Baal Tosafot. The Gasena Birushami, then I quote the Yerushami that we're going to look at in a moment. And he ends by saying, "V'chen hinhiru kol rabotenu laniach tefillin b'chol hamoed." All the Chachamim that we follow here, he means in Germany, they all said that we should wear tefillin b'chol hamoed, and that was also the practice. So, having clarified those historical facts, we need to ask ourselves now the following question: is it in fact true that there is no clear implication in any sugya in the Talmud or in the Mishnah from which one might be able to discover whether one is supposed to wear tefillin on Chol HaMoed or not? Because after all, the claim of some poskim, such as the Radbaz and the Beit Yosef that we just discussed, was it seemed that this halacha is somewhat lost in the mists of the Talmudic literature. We don't have a clear indication which way to go. Therefore we follow the leader of the Mekubalim. Is it in fact so that there is no clear indication in those sources? So those of you who have Masechet HaMoed Katan open should open it now to Daf Yod Het Amud Yod Het Amud Beth at the bottom in Moed Katan. The Mishnah states as follows. There is an Isur. Let's begin with the following words of introduction. There is an Isur, as we know, to do different kinds of melacha on Chol HaMoed. One of the things that we're told in the Mishnah we're not allowed to do on Chol HaMoed is to write. Although writing is, as we're about to see, writing doesn't mean just to scribble a note or to write down a phone number. Writing means a formal kind of calligraphy. In other words, the kind of writing the sofer does, for example, right? Which is a job, which is work that people get paid for. Or writing up a legal document. So the Mishnah states, En kotevim shitre hov b'moed. In other words, a shtar hov is a document which says that so-and-so borrowed such and such an amount of money from so-and-so and has to repay it within a certain period of time. That's a shtar hov. In other words, it's a legal document which has to be written up in a formal manner, and it's usually done by a sofer. So this Mishnah is really speaking about what a sofer does or doesn't do on Chol HaMoed, because most people don't write shitrei hov. Just as we're about to see, most people don't write tefillin or mezuzot, right? You can if you learn, but most people don't, so they hire someone else to do so. So the Mishnah says, En kotavim shitrei hov b'moed. If on the other hand the sofer himself has no money to buy food, even for Chol HaMoed, he's allowed to write such a document to earn some money to be able to buy food for Chol HaMoed. Or this person who wants a loan, he doesn't really believe him that if he gives him the money without a written document of proof that he lent him the money, he's worried that he will never get the money back. Then in that case he's allowed to do so, because there is a miswah, minat Torah, to lend money to a poor person, to help a person out in his time of need. But if you're not quite sure whether you're going to get the money back or not, you're allowed to write the shtar hov, even on Chol HaMoed, for this, in order to do this miswah. So either way, the Mishnah says you're not allowed to write a shtar hov on Chol HaMoed unless there's some miswah involved. What's the miswah? Either that you're giving him a loan, which is a miswah minat Torah, or you're going to have money to buy food for Chol HaMoed. It's also a miswah. Okay. He goes on to say further, En kothavim sefarim tefillin umzuzot b'moed. One does not write sefarim. The word sefarim includes a sefer Torah or nevi'im or ketuvim. In those days, all these books were written separately in Megillot, right? Like a Megillat Esther is a separate Megillah, a separate roll of parchment, right? All such books, whether it was a Megillah of Sefer Yeshayahu or a Sefer Torah, they're all written like a big Megillah or a small Megillah, depending on parchment, written by a sofer. A sofer, and the sofer, of course, does this and gets paid for doing so. It's his job. You do not write, a sofer should not write these things on Chol HaMoed. He's not allowed to do so. وَإِن مَجِهِينَ أُثَحَاتٍ, even to correct a book which is already written. In other words, a Sefer Torah which needs correction. In other words, it was found there was a letter missing, or a few extra letters, or a word was forgotten. Has to be corrected. That is also not done on Chol HaMoed. Afilu en magin othahat, even one letter is not to be corrected on Chol HaMoed, because it's not urgent. It doesn't have to be done this moment. It can wait till after the Chag. So you wait a few days, and then the sofer will sit down and take care of it. Afilu Sefer Ha'azara, that's the correct Girsah. There's another Girsah, Sefer Ezra. Either way, Sefer Ha'azara means there was a Sefer Torah in the Beit Mikdash, in the Azara, which was the standard official copy from which all Sefer Torah were to be checked against that copy to make sure they were correct. In other words, even in that central copy needs correction, or it needs it's very old. It has to be letters have to be written over again with ink to make them clearer or stronger, darker, because they may have faded over the probably centuries. This is not to be done on Chol HaMoed. You will also note, by the way, and this is very relevant to our discussion, that this quote is that we're reading here. This Mishnah appears in Perek Shlishi of Masechet, what's it called? Moed Katan. Another word for this Masechet is Stam Masechet Moed, or a third name for this Masechet is Masechet Mashkin, which is the first word in the Masechet. As I mentioned last week, Chol HaMoed has its own Masechet called Masechet Moed or Moed Katan. Yom Tov has its own another Masechet called Masechet Yom Tov or Masechet Besa. This Mishnah, when talking about Chol HaMoed, what does it say? It says En Kotavim Shitrei Chov when B'Moed. When speaking about Chol HaMoed, the term that's used in the Mishnah always, without exception, is Moed. It never says Yom Tov by mistake, or in passing, or it never uses that term, because Yom Tov means something else, as we see in front of us now, and as we're about to explain further. So it always says you mustn't do this on Moed, during the Moed. When it says En Kotavim Sefarim Tefillin Umuzuzot, when? By Moed. So from here we begin to see at least that Yom Tov does not include Chol HaMoed. Yom Tov is a term which means only Yomim Tovim, and Chol HaMoed has its own term, which is Moed. The Mishnah continues and says, Rabbi Yehuda Omer, Kotev Adam Tefillin u'mezuzot la'asmo. A person may write Tefillin and mezuzot for himself on Chol HaMoed. V'toreh al yerecho techeleth l'sisitho. And similarly, he's allowed to spin wool and to make techeleth for sisith, and to make sisith for his beged, so he can put on his garment, so he can wear it during the Chag, during the Moed. He's allowed to do so for himself, not for money, not to be hired by others to do so, because that's melacha. That's normal work that one does during the year on a weekday, and one doesn't do normal work that one does during the year during the Moed. In the Perush, there's usually associated with Rashi, although the Perush Moed Katan that we have is not exactly Perush Rashi, but leaving that aside, it's nevertheless a Perush from the time of the Rishonim without a doubt. We actually do have at least the remains of the real Perush Rashi Moed Katan, which I have over there. But the Perush that appears here on the Daf, that's printed here in the Talmud Bavli, on these words of Rabbi Yehuda, who says that a person may write Tefillin. Who writes Tefillin? As you said before, or mezuzot. A sofer does this. So a person who's a sofer may write for himself. What does it mean for himself? Because he needs it. Why does he need it? Because he needs a mezuzah, for example. You have to have a mezuzah in your home on Chol HaMoed. Well, you have to. So if you haven't got one, or something happened to it, you have to get another one. So he's allowed to write for himself. And Rashi says, La'asmo lekayem zeh miswa, to keep this, to do this miswa. So from that already we understand that one does wear tefillin on Chol HaMoed, just as one has to have a mezuzah on Chol HaMoed. And if therefore you don't have one, he can write one for himself, because that's not work that he's doing to make money. He's not being mezalzel b'moed in the sense of going to work on Chol HaMoed as he normally would. He's doing something so he can make the mitzvah. Correct? As we saw at the beginning of the Mishnah, the first statement of the Mishnah was that he can write out a shtar hov, that is to say, a document which says that so-and-so borrowed money from so-and-so, because there's a mitzvah involved in doing so. In the same way, he can write tefillin and mezuzot for himself on during the moed, says Rabbi Yehuda, because that's not schirut. That's what Rashi says here. That's not being hired out by someone and doing work on Chol HaMoed. That's just doing what needs to be done, so you'll be able to do the mitzvah. Aval lisbor, limkor, that you're not allowed to do. That's there a schirut, that you're not allowed to do. In other words, what does a sofer normally do? He writes, let's say, mezuzot or tefillin, and he has a stock of them in his shop or in his home, and then people who know that he's a sofer and they need tefillin mezuzot, they come to him and he sells them. But he has to have on hand, or at least he often would like to have on hand, so he has usually a few in reserve at least. That you're not allowed to do on Chol HaMoed. He's not allowed to write up to increase his stock of mezuzot, so they have what to sell after the moed. But if he needs one for himself now, says Rabbi Yehuda, that's the simple, plain meaning of the Mishnah, then he's allowed to do so. And the same applies to tzitzit, which therefore implies that one, quite clearly, that one wears tefillin or Chol HaMoed. Otherwise, why is he allowed to write for himself? That's the claim. I'll read a few Rishonim on this in a moment. Yes, there's a question.
What if he has no stock and someone comes to buy one because they need for themselves and they can't write it themselves?
Alright, well that's a good question, but the Mishnah said a moment before, En kothavim sefarim tefillin u'mezuzot b'moed. The sofer is not allowed to write either sefarim, which is a sefer Torah, shall we say, or tefillin or mezuzot during the moed, even if someone wants to buy. He's not allowed to write during the moed because that's his parnasah, and you don't do things to do with parnasah on Chol HaMoed unless he has nothing to eat, as we said before. And if he has nothing to eat, or she'en lo ma yochal, if he has nothing to eat, arez yichtov. But if he's not that hard up, then he doesn't write on Chol HaMoed. But for himself, that's not work. It's not parnasah. It's to do the mitzvah. Tomorrow morning he has to wear tefillin. Tomorrow morning he has to have a mezuzah on his door. That you can do. And the same is true, of course, for the techeleth, for the tzitzit. So he has to wear a beggar with tzitzit. He has to do that right now. He can't wait. That's at least an obvious and fairly seems straightforward way of understanding the Mishnah. Rosh, in his teshuvah on the subject, and also in Hilchot Tefillin, as we read last time, he says, the Rosh who holds that one does wear tefillin on Chol HaMoed, he says from here we see clearly that a person must wear tefillin on Chol HaMoed. Otherwise, what's the difference between for himself and for someone else? The difference is, if you say that he has to wear tefillin for himself right now during the moed, and he has no tefillin to wear, then we understand why we're told that he's allowed to write tefillin for himself during the moed. But if one does not wear tefillin during Chol HaMoed, then why are we told that he may write for himself tefillin during Chol HaMoed? Let him write them after the moed. Now you may say, well, he may not have time. The moed, the chag ends when it ends on a certain day at night, and the next morning he's going to need tefillin. So the Rosh writes in his teshuvah that he can write the Motzei Chag, right? The end of the last day of Pesach, Shvish Pesach, ends in the evening, and that in the evening he'll write that tefillin for the next morning. The Ra'avad, who is reported by the Rashba as having held that one does not wear tefillin on Chol HaMoed, how did he respond to this? He said, he wasn't responding to the Rosh because he was before the Rosh, but he responded to this argument by saying that the reason he's allowed to write for himself on Chol HaMoed is not because you wear them on Chol HaMoed, but rather because he may not be able to write what he needs to have written, have it ready at night at the end of Pesach, shall we say, for the next morning. He says maybe too much, not enough hours in the night. He has to go to sleep, whatever. So he won't manage, and therefore, in order that he'll have them ready for the next day when he will wear tefillin, which is after the Chag, he's allowed to write them during the moed. It's not, and again, it's because it's not parnasah. He's doing it for himself, but not because he's doing it for himself. Because now during the moed he needs it. He needs it the morning immediately after the Chag, and he's not going to have time to do it unless you allow him to do it. Start doing it now. So says the Ravad. So, which is interesting, mahloket, so to speak. It depends how quickly a sofer writes, and how quickly the ink dries, and how quickly he can roll up the parshiyot and sew them into the batim. I don't know. Maybe the Ravad thought that it takes longer than the Rosh thought that such a thing should take. I don't know. But so it is possible, perhaps, to claim otherwise. But certainly many Rishonim thought from this Mishnah that this was powerful proof that one wears tefillin on HaMoed. So the clear implication here is that the sofer is being told the sofer may write for himself tefillin because he needs them now, mamash. He needs them for the moed. So I'll quote a few Rishonim who explain this Gemara in this manner, and then we'll see what the Yerushalmi says on this matter. Well, before I read the Ran, actually what I should do is read the Baraitha. So let's read the Baraitha, which appears on Daf Yod Tet Amud Aleph at the top, the very first line. It says, Tenor Rabbanan. Here we have a Baraitha, which brings the views of Rabbi Meir, Rabbi Yehuda, and Rabbi Yosef. כותב אדם תפילין ומזוזות לעצמו וטועה על ירחו תחלת לסיסיתו ולאחרים בטובה. So Rabbi Meir says one may write tefillin and mezuzot for oneself. We're talking about Chol HaMoed, of course, and also one may spin the wool and make it into strings for sisith for oneself on one's thigh, not in the usual way. You do a certain shinui. It's usually done with a pelech, with a stone, whatever. He does it in a slightly different way, but you're allowed to do so during Chol HaMoed. And the implication is because he needs it for himself. But for others, he may only do so if he's being paid to do so. For others, he can't do it as a favor. If he's being paid to do so, he may do so. The reason Rabbi Meir apparently holds this is because it's a miswah. These are things which, after all, are all matters of miswah, tefillin, mezuzah, sisith, and therefore, even though there's isur to write on Chol HaMoed, but if it's for the purpose of a miswah such as these, it's mutar. Now that's the view of Rabbi Meir. Rabbi Yehuda says, Ma'arim u'mocher et shelo v'chozer v'chotev l'asmo. Rabbi Yehuda says if someone comes to him and says, I want to buy a pair of tefillin during Chol HaMoed, he can sell his own tefillin to this person, and then he himself won't have tefillin, then he can write for himself. Because as the Mishnah stated before, and that statement of the Mishnah reflects the view of Rabbi Yehuda, at least in part, that for himself he may write. So if he sold what he had, he doesn't have for himself now. Now he's allowed to write. And Rabbi Yosef is more lenient, and he says, "Kotev u'mocher kedarko panasato," that he may write as he normally does in order to make a living. Again, apparently because Rabbi Yosef says these things are all connected to important miswot, and the isur of writing shouldn't apply to things which are connected to important miswot. And according to the Perush that is known as Perush Rashi here, in Moed Katan, the third line, Rashi says, Kedei parnasato b'harwaha, we're not talking about someone who has nothing to eat. As we mentioned in the Mishnah, in the case of sofer has nothing to eat, then he's allowed to write even a shtar hov, which is not a miswah, or less of a miswah than tefillin, you would think. But here we're talking about someone he has what to eat, but nevertheless he's allowed to write and get paid for doing so on Chol HaMoed, if it's for tefillin or mezuzot, or to make sisiyot, because it's an important miswah. The Ran, Chidushei Ran, on this Mishnah and on this Baraitha, he says as follows. He says the correct Perush is as follows. The Mishnah is according to the view of Rabbi Meir. Umatnitin bechotev la'achirim b'sachar, aval la'asmo, o la'achirim b'tova mutar. In other words, the Mishnah says, Ein kotavim sefarim tefillin mezuzot b'moed. So one doesn't. It says the Mishnah, you're not allowed to write tefillin on Chol HaMoed. When is this Mishnah saying this? when you're writing lahirim b'sachar, when as a sofer normally does, he writes tefillin, shall we say, for others, and he gets paid for it b'sachar. That one doesn't do it on Chol HaMoed. Why? Because it's parnasah, it's work, and that's the whole isur, whether it's min Torah or min dirabanan, of not doing work on Chol HaMoed is exactly that, not to do your normal work on Chol HaMoed. So if a sofer who normally writes and gets paid for writing for others were to do so on Chol HaMoed, there'd be no difference in Chol HaMoed than any other day for him, and we don't want that. So the Mishnah says you're not allowed to write tefillin and mezuzot on Chol HaMoed, and that's referring to writing for others and being paid for it in the normal fashion. However, to write for himself, in other words, because he needs himself, tefillin, or to write for others b'tovah, which means to do it as a favor, that's mutar, because it's not work. You're doing it as a favor. It's not parnasah. It's not the regular kind of work that one does. And Rabbi Yehuda disagrees, as we saw in the Braitha just now, and says that one is allowed to write only for oneself, not for others. Even if you're doing it as a favor, you can't mezalzel b'chol HaMoed, you can't make light of Chol HaMoed in order to do someone else a favor. You want to do favors, do it on your own time, not on Chol HaMoed. Do it after Chol HaMoed, do it after the Chag. You can be a tzaddik at your own expense, not at the expense of Chol HaMoed. But if you need tefillin for yourself, you can write. So it makes no difference whether you're doing it for others for money or not. For others you don't write. So says Rabbi Yehuda. But for yourself you do. In other words, the maskana, the upshot of this is that both according to Rabbi Meir and according to Rabbi Yehuda, for oneself, one may write tefillin and mezuzot on Chol HaMoed. So the question again is why? Is it because we're talking about miswot that person may be short of what he needs to do the miswah, like a mezuzah or tefillin, and he needs it right now on Chol HaMoed, which would prove that Chol HaMoed is the time when you wear tefillin? Or is it because he needs tefillin, but not now, because Chol HaMoed you don't wear tefillin, but he's going to need it in a few days, and in order to have it in a few days, he has to do it now. So that's really the mahloket. So then the Ran goes on to say that Tosafot learned from here, which is, again, there were many different opinions amongst the Balei Tosafot. Some of the Tosafot said yes, some said no. He quotes some Tosafot that say that you do wear tefillin Chol HaMoed based on this Mishnah. And then he also says that Chen nir'eh Yerushalmi. And I'll read the Yerushalmi to you in a moment. And then he says, אבל הרעב"ד ז"ל כתב שהתירו לכתוב תפילין במועד אף על פי שאין מועד זמן תפילין כדי שיהיו מזומנים לו להר המועד. The Ravad who holds you do not wear tefillin on Chol HaMoed explains this Mishnah by saying that he's allowed to write for himself, which is not the normal kind of work he does. He's not doing it to be paid, but he needs it for himself. Even though he don't wear tefillin on Chol HaMoed, he's doing it to have tefillin when he will need them shortly, in a few days' time. Yes.
In today's world, it takes to make a pair of tefillin.
To write them?
To write and then also to go and form the leather.
Well, they're talking about two different things. You're talking about making the batim from hide. Well, that's a longer process because that involves taking the hide and making it wet, soaking it in different materials, making it wet, and then putting it on a form. And at least nowadays it's done with a hydraulic press, etc. And then it has to dry. It has to be on that press for a certain amount of time. In other words, you're talking about a process that takes at least days to make the batim. To write parashiyot, a fast sofer, I think, could do it in a day. But we have a sofer here, so why don't we ask him? What do you say, Rabbi Micha?
There's tremendous range. Someone writes something you could do in a day. It's slow, fine calligraphy, fine writing could take a number of days. But it's possible for a fast sofer to do it in a day.
I also personally doubt whether at that time, at the time of the Mishnah, they wrote in the same manner, in the same style as is customary today. So I'm fairly certain the time was shorter than it is today on average. But even today, Rav Micha is saying that it can be done in a day. All right. So, but again, not everyone would tell you it can be done in a day. Some would say it would take 2 days, 3 days, depending. I imagine then the writing was more simple and less fancy, less a work of art, and less fewer halachic requirements as to the way letters must be formed, etc. Because most of what is considered halakha regarding the writing of letters today, many of these halachot have no basis in the Talmud at all. They're much later inventions. Some of them inventions of the last 100 years, literally. You seem surprised by what I'm saying, but I assure you it's so. I'm also speaking as someone who studied to be a sofer, and I know how to write, and I study these things, and I'm telling you that many halachot that are considered today standard and self-evident requirements when it comes to kitav were unheard of hundreds of years ago, and many tefillin that today would be considered pasul, there was not a pair of tefillin in Eastern Europe 200 years ago that wasn't written that way. They were all written that way, and I think Rav Micha will confirm what I'm saying, and he's an active sofer. Anyhow, that's the Gemara we have here in the Talmud Bavli. What do we have in the Talmud Yerushalmi? It says in the Talmud Yerushalmi, this is quoted by many Rishonim, the same sugya that we just discussed now, Moed Katan, Perek Gimel, Halacha Daled, in the Talmud Yerushalmi. So as we said, the Mishnah states that one is not allowed to write Tefillin and Mezuzot on Chol HaMoed. We're talking about a sofer who's the person who normally writes these things. And we explained that he doesn't write in a normal way in order to make money on Chol HaMoed. But what happens if someone really needs Tefillin? Especially, for example, just one if imagines hypothetically that one needs to wear Tefillin on Chol HaMoed. What happens then? So the Talmud Yerushalmi discusses exactly this, or something very similar, because it says, Had bar nash, a certain person, Ovad tefiloi, he lost his tefillin, b'mu'adha, on Chol HaMoed. Athal Rabbi Hananel, he came before Rabbi Hananel, who was a sofer. He wanted to write tefillin. Rabbi Hananel wanted to know whether it's mutar. Wasn't sure. He wanted to ask the Rav. He sent him to speak to Rabbi Bar Nathan, asking what to do. Amar le, and Rabbi Bar Nathan said to this person, or to the sofer, he said to Rabbi Hananel the sofer, he said, Have le tefilach, give him your tefillin. In other words, sell him your tefillin. Wazil kathavlach, and you can go write for yourself, which is exactly what we saw in the Baraita, you recall. Rabbi Yehuda said you can sell him his to the person who needs tefillin, and then you yourself have no tefillin, so then you're someone who needs to write for himself, and that you're allowed to do. So it's a kind of ha'arama in a way. In other words, it's a bit of a kunz, but seeing that there's a big miswa of writing tefillin, of writing tefillin bichlal and writing a sefer Torah. Well, it's talking about tefillin here. So writing tefillin or mezuzot is a miswa. These miswot of tefillin and mezuzah are very important miswot. And the isur, especially if we understand the isur of melachah of Chol HaMoed bichlal is midivrehem, midrabanan, not min Torah. So such a ha'arama, such a kunz is allowed. So that's what he said to him. And then they apparently also asked Rav, or Rav heard of this, and Rav said, Izel Katovle, you don't have to sell him yours and then write for yourself. You can just write for him directly without any pretense. So the Talmud Yerushalmi immediately says, wait a second, the Mishnah disagrees. The Mishnah says otherwise. The Mishnah said, Mathnitha Peliga. The Mishnah said that a person may not write tefillin for others on Chol HaMoed, correct? So what does the Talmud Yerushalmi say? Because the Mishnah states, Kotev hu adam tefillin u'mezuzah la'asmo, ha'laher la. For himself he's not, only for himself, but for others he's not allowed to. The Yerushalmi goes on to say, Pathar la bechotev lahaniach. Rav explains the Mishnah to be speaking about a case where a person writes tefillin kedei lahaniach. Now what does the word lahaniach mean? The problem here is that people today used to using the word lahaniach in the sense of lahaniach tefillin. But the fact is that you don't actually see Chazal using that terminology, even though there is a bracha lahaniach tefillin or miswat hanachach tefillin. But that's according to the Yerushalmi. According to the Talmud Yerushalmi, the two brachot on tefillin are al miswat tefillin for the shaliyad and al miswat hanachat tefillin for the shalosh. And there, at least according to Yerushalmi, it makes a bit more sense. The hanacha means to place on top of something. Lahaniach. So you can understand it as being shach with the sharosh, whereas the sheliab, which is tied on, not so much placed on top of, it makes less sense. So that's why Yerushalmi doesn't have that nusach of lahaniach tefillin. But in general terms, the Chachamim, when speaking about wearing tefillin, either say to wear, lilbosh, lovesh tefillin, as we'll see in another sugya, another shiur probably. We'll see in Masechet Eruvin, where it talks about wearing tefillin, because they are a kind of malbush, they're a kind of it's something one wears, just like as in the same way that one wears not only clothing, also one wears, let's say, a chain around one's neck, shall we say, right? Or a watch, you say you wear it, right? So tefillin are something which are worn on the bodies, you wear them, lil bosh. Chazal also use the term liten, right? Nothen tefillin, in other words, to place them, to put them on oneself. And what the word lahaniach doesn't necessarily mean to wear tefillin. And here it does, and many Rishonim, or actually all the Rishonim, understand this, the language here to mean that the intention of the Mishnah is that one may not write tefillin and mezuzot on Chol HaMoed lahaniach, in other words, to set aside, because the word lahaniach also means to set aside. Lahaniach basad, to set aside, put in your cupboard, so that you can sell it after the Moed, after the Hag, which is what a sofer normally does. So Rav says, the Mishnah says that a person, a sofer, does not write tefillin and mezuzot on Chol HaMoed lahaniach, to put aside, so he'll have a stock. So when people come and say, I need 10 mezuzot for my new mansion, because I have 10 rooms, then we'll have 10 to sell him, correct? That's lahaniach. But if a person needs it right now because someone stole his mezuzah, or it fell off and it got lost, and now he has a door without a mezuzah, he needs it right now, he needs it tomorrow morning, then you can write immediately, because it's not lahaniach. It's not to place and sell eventually. It's for doing the miswah now. And here we're talking about tefillin. If that's the case, it seems clear from this Yerushalmi that this person needed tefillin right now. And Rav said to the sofer, you can write tefillin for him directly, right now, on Chol HaMoed, because he needs them now. He has to wear tefillin tomorrow, today. The Mishnah, which said not to write for others on Chol HaMoed, was talking about writing and putting aside to sell later, which is the normal way that a sofer, or many soferim, work that way. They always have some in reserve to sell to people who come and say, I need them right now. The Mishnah says la'asmo, if he needs them now, and not to write for aherim, meaning for aherim that who will come to you eventually after the Chag and say, I want to buy tefillin from you. So you'll have to sell them when they come, as soon as they come to you. But for someone else who needs tefillin now, then you're allowed to write, says Rav, and it makes sense, because it's just like la'asmo. What's the difference between you and the other person? He's a Jew and you're a Jew. You need to wear tefillin, he needs to wear tefillin. If the reason that one is allowed to wear tefillin, the reason one is allowed to write tefillin on Chol HaMoed is that one wears tefillin on Chol HaMoed, and if you haven't got them, you're going to need them immediately, then the same applies to him. He's also as Jewish as you are. He needs tefillin as much as you do. If you say that, so therefore Rav says, the Mishnah says you may not write for others, only for yourself. That's referring to write kotev lahaniach, to place and put on the cupboard and sell eventually when someone comes to you after the Chag and says, I need tefillin. So the implication from this Yerushalmi, at least so it's understood by many Rishonim, including the Rosh, and I'll read a couple more Rishonim to you to prove this point, which I just read to you the Ran. The Ran said, so it seems from the Yerushalmi. He was referring to this Yerushalmi. So the Ran also understood this Yerushalmi in this way. That this Yerushalmi says clearly that this person required tefillin. It says in Furash that he lost tefillin. It says, Ovad tefilloi b'mu'adah. He lost his tefillin during the Moed. Now, why should we care if he loses his tefillin during the Moed? He doesn't need them right now. He needs them afterwards, correct? So the Ravad might say here also he may not have time to write them Motzei Chag after the Chag is over, and the guy's going to need them next morning, so he's allowed to write them really now. But it seems a simpler understanding is that the person needs to fill in now during the Moed, and Rav, as opposed to the first Rav who was asked, Rav said you can write now and fill in for him today, because he needs them today. And because a person who needs them today, even though it's not yourself, it's someone else, it's like writing for yourself, because it's writing to perform the miswah. as opposed to writing in order to make a parnasah. That's the difference. When you write to sell to someone else, when someone else comes and asks you for them, you're writing to make parnasah. When you write for someone else who needs it today, you're also making parnasah perhaps, but you're also allowing someone to perform the mitzvah immediately, and that can be done even on Chol HaMoed, just as you can write for yourself on Chol HaMoed. Just as the Mishnah says, one can make tzitzit for oneself on Chol HaMoed, because you're going to need tzitzit now, immediately. And just as tzitzit, vadai, is noheg b'moed, even though the mitzvah of tzitzit vadai is shayach during Chol HaMoed, though we don't say that there's no mitzvah of tzitzit during Chol HaMoed, no one says that, correct? And so when the Rabbi Yehuda compares writing tefillin for oneself or making tzitzit on Chol HaMoed, it makes sense. He's comparing two things which are analogous. In other words, they're both things that might be required immediately during the Moed. So from this sugya, particularly from the Yerushalmi, which is a bit more suggestive and more emphatic, though it seems that the one must wait for the Chol HaMoed. From this Yerushalmi, many Rishonim understood that one does wear tefillin on Chol HaMoed, and this was seen as a powerful proof of this fact. So we mentioned the Ran, we mentioned the Rosh, and let's mention now the Rambam. What does the Rambam say? The Rambam says, to recap what the Rambam says about tefillin, first of all, you're looking at Chot Tefillin Perek Daled, Halacha Yod. The Rambam told us that one wears tefillin during the day and not during the night, and then he goes on to say, V'chen Shabbatoth v'yamim tovim, enam zman tefillin, shene'ema v'ya lecha la'oth, v'shabbathot v'yamim tovim, hen asmam oth. So the Rambam tells us explicitly one does not wear tefillin on Shabbat and Yom Tov. Now, I mentioned last week, and I mention again now. The first question, therefore, if one wants to know what the view of the Rambam is to find out which days are, in the Rambam's view, called Yamim Tovim. And then we'll know, one would imagine, what the Rambam meant to say when he said you don't wear tefillin on Shabbat and Yamim Tovim. So if one goes to Ilchot Yom Tov, the very first halacha in Ilchot Shvitat Yom Tov, which is after Ilchot Shabbat and Eruvin and Shvitat Asor, you will find Shvitat Yom Tov, Perek Aleph Halacha Aleph. This I mentioned last week, but it bears repetition. The Rambam says very clearly, Sheshet HaYomim HaElu, these 6 days, She'asaran HaKathuv Ba'asiyat Melacha, that are Asur Min Torah, HaKathuv means the Torah, to do Melacha during these days. And what the 6 days am I referring to? Rishon U'Shvi'i Shel Pesach, that's 2 days. Rishon U'Shmini Shel Chag HaSukkot, that's 4. V'Yom Chag HaShavuot, that's 5. U'V'Echad LaChodesh HaShvi'i, that's Rosh Hashanah, that's 6 days. These 6 days of the year, Hen HaNikra'im Yamim Tovim, says the Rambam. This alone, I think, would make it very clear, beyond any reasonable doubt. And we know that in the United States, people are placed on electric chairs and inside gas chambers because there's no reasonable doubt. Correct? So the same, one would think, should also apply in halachic discussions. And in fact, that's exactly how halacha works. The Tosafot will sometimes tell you that something is mutar, even a very major isur, in this case doesn't apply because of a diuk that they learn from the language of the Talmud or something. In other words, a clear indication is enough. It doesn't have, not everything has to be written in letters 6 feet tall on a skyscraper in black on white for everyone to see in order to know that it's true. It's enough that a statement says something, it says in a certain way, uses a certain terminology, which implies clearly a certain thing. That's enough to know. That's how halacha works as a rule. One doesn't need 150% certainty. And even sometimes doesn't always even require 100% certainty. 95% will do a lot of the time. When the Rambam tells you do not wear tefillin on Shabbat and Yom Tov, and tells you in Ilchot Yom Tov, Shvitat Yom Tov, Perek Aleph Halacha Aleph, that there are 6 days of the year called Yom Tov, I don't think there's any room for any doubt any longer. There's no reasonable doubt whatsoever. The Rambam thinks that you wear tefillin on Chol HaMoed. But just in case, and there are many Jews that we need to take into account, just in case someone's very, very, very obstinate and insistent that this is somehow not sufficient proof, well, let's see what the Rambam writes about writing on Chol HaMoed. Rambam writes Perek Zayin in Chol Shvitat Yom Tov Perek Zayin, where he talks about Hol HaMoed. Halacha Yod Bet or Yod Gimel, depending on the version that you have. Perek Zayin Halacha Yod Bet. The Rambam says, "Wa asur lichtov b'moed." It is forbidden to write on Hol HaMoed. Again, the Rambam doesn't say Yom Tov. The Rambam says Moed, because as we already pointed out, the term for Hol HaMoed is Moed. The term for Yom Tov is Yom Tov. Afilu sefarim tefillin mezuzot. And it was not other things that you may want to write, like you may want to write a novel, or because you're a novelist and you make money from it, or what have you. Even things which are clearly a miswa, like writing tefillin, one does not do on Yom Tov. On Hol HaMoed, says the Rambam. This is the Mishnah that we just learned in Moed Katan. وَإِن مَجِهِنَ فِلُو أَفَحَث بِسَفِرْ هَعَزَرَةٍ. See the correct Yusah, Sefer HaZarah, the Rambam says. In other words, even to correct one letter in a Sefer Torah, even a very important Sefer Torah, one doesn't do on Hol HaMoed. Why, says the Rambam? مِپَنَي شَزَوْ مَلَخَا شَئِنَا لَصَوْرِخ HaMoed. Because this is work that does not need to be done for the Moed. It doesn't have to be done right now. Nothing will happen. The world won't come to an end if you wait 3 days and do it after the Chag. This Sefer Torah needs to be corrected. Nachon. So wait 3 days and correct it. Normally you want to correct it as fast as possible, but now it's Hol HaMoed, so you wait. A person wants to make a living as a sofer, yafeh ma'od, sheyeh bari v'chazak v'Hashem yasliach et darko, but he doesn't have to run a Hol HaMoed. So if he wants to write mezuzot or tefillin for people, and he gets paid for this, he may do so, but not on Hol HaMoed, because it's not essential for the Moed. One of the rules, one of the klalim, regarding malacha that may be done on Hol HaMoed is things that need to be done for Hol HaMoed dafka, that need to be done now and they can't wait. Right? Devar ha'aved, something which if you don't do now, you won't be able to do later. Or if you don't take the job now, you'll lose the job forever. Right? And the person needs the money. Normally, if the guy would say, well, if you want to do it after the Chag, I'll wait for you to do this job after the Chag. And he needs the money. But he won't wait for you. He'll find someone else to do it, or find a non-Jew to do it. So that's called Devar ha'aved. That's also mutar. Something that can wait. You wait. Aval, says the Rambam, Kotev hu adam tefillin u'mezuzah la'asmo, but for himself he may write tefillin u'mezuzot, v'tower techelet levigdo, or he may make himself sisiyot, and techelet for his sisif. Why? The Rambam just told you don't write tefillin on Hol HaMoed because it's not a malacha that's required for the Moed. But for himself, he does write tefillin. Why? If it's not a malacha that's required for the Moed, why do you do it? Why can you write it for yourself? Because the implication is it is a malacha that's required now for the Moed. You can eat it now, mamash now. You lost your tefillin on the tiyul yesterday. Tomorrow morning you need tefillin, so you stay up at night and you write the tefillin if you know how to. And if you don't know how to, then you go to the Yerushalmi, and the Yerushalmi tells you what you do. You go to the sofer and you ask him to write for you, and the sofer says, well, let's go ask the Rav, and the Rav says, well, you sell yours and give him the other. Rav says, no, you don't have to do that. You can buy directly write for this person. That's exactly what the Yerushalmi is telling you. In such a case, exactly that happened. So the Rambam says, one does not write or even correct Sifrei Torah or write mezuzot on Hol HaMoed, mipnei shezo melacha she'ena l'sorech HaMoed, because it's not required for Hol HaMoed. But then he says you may do so for oneself. Kotev adam tefillin muzala asmo. The implication is because it is required for the Moed. So the clear implication of the Rambam here is that one does wear tefillin on Hol HaMoed. That's exactly what the Kesef Mishnah also said in Hichot Tefillin Perek Daled. The Rambam, he quoted this Rambam and said, so it seems from the Rambam. So it's not just my interpretation. It's a clear implication of the Rambam that one does wear tefillin on Hol HaMoed. The fact that I said before that the Rambam says, as Chazal say, that one does not wear tefillin on Yamim Tovim, and the Rambam himself tells you that Yamim Tovim refers to 6 specific days of the year, which does not include Hol HaMoed, that's just another proof. So how many proofs does one need? As the Rambam himself writes somewhere, how many times does it say in the Torah, Shema Yisrael, Adonai Eloheinu, Adonai Echad? It says it once. His point is that if something's true and you said it once, it's enough. What we're proving now is time and again, we're not bringing one proof or 2 proofs, we're bringing many proofs that one does wear tefillin on Hol HaMoed. From the Rambam himself, we just brought 2 proofs. And then we have the Rosh, and we have many other Rishonim. When you add up the numbers, so to speak, if one wants to, and I don't want to, but if one has a numerical, mathematical approach to halakha, one wants to write lists, who said yes, who said no, who are the pros and the cons, who are for tefillin, who are against tefillin. If you do that, you will see that many more Rishonim, many more Rishonim are for wearing tefillin, as opposed to saying that one does not wear tefillin. In the Haggadah Maimonides, we saw Rabbeinu Shimshon, the Rosh Mishans, in other words, said that one wears tefillin, a very major Rishon. Rabbeinu Simcha was quoted as saying we wear tefillin. Rabbeinu Baruch was quoted as saying we wear tefillin. We saw the Rambam wears tefillin. According to the Rosh, one wears tefillin. According to the Rif, there's really no basis to suggest that he says otherwise. So apparently, it's quite clear you do wear tefillin. And there are others. The Or Zarua, for example. The Or Zarua was a very major Rishon in Ashkenaz before the Rosh, and he has a very interesting piece on this very issue of Tefillin l'Chol HaMoed before the Rosh. Marami Rothenburg was a Talmid of the Or Zarua, and Marami Rothenburg was the Rav of the Rosh. And the Marami Rothenburg, who was the Rav of the Rosh, says about the Or Zarua on a certain halacha where he didn't really agree with his Rav's opinion, but he says, I can't be posek against him because my little finger is not as rather my waist is not as wide as his little finger, so I can't say anything. So if he said that it's asur, even though he himself brought several rayot that it's not so, but he wasn't willing to actually come out and say it's not so. So just to show you that you should know who the Or Zarua was. This was the Rabbeinu Yitzhak Rabbi Moshe Mivina from Vienna, and he was one of the greatest chachamim in Ashkenaz at that time, or any time for that matter. Yes, here it is, the Or Zarua Chof Tefillin Siman Tel Chof Pei Tef. Alright? He discusses this matter at some length. He brings the different sugyot and even other sugyot that we haven't mentioned so far. He also brings the Yerushalmi that we just quoted. He also says that from this Yerushalmi it seems clear that one wears Tefillin l'Chol HaMoed. I'm not going to read all of this to you. I'm just going to read a few lines because it's quite lengthy. And if you wish to read it yourself, by all means. The Or Zarua is one of the most beautiful books from the entire period of the Rishonim. If one has the patience and the ability, it's just well worth looking at. He writes as follows: Nathati ath libi lafur v'lidrosh. I took it upon myself to look into this question and delve into this matter of im mutar lidrosh tefillin b'chol HaMoed. He writes actually mutar, if it's permissible to wear tefillin b'chol HaMoed. That's what he writes. Ya'an ki ra'iti mistapekim b'ha detanya ba'komes, because I see there are those who have a doubt about that which we saw in Masechet Menachot, where it says you don't wear in Shabbat and Yom Tov. He quotes that Gemara. And then he says, ani, and I'm very surprised. How could anyone think this is a safek? How can one imagine the Chol HaMoed is called an off? Is it possible that days which are mutar b'melacha minat Torah can be called an off? In other words, he's adopting the position at this point, which he, by the way, later he changed his mind about this particular point. He here is adopting the position, which is mefurash in the Talmud Yerushalmi that it is so, that Isur Malacha and Chol HaMoed is only midrabanan, not minat Torah. So he's saying, if Isur Malacha is only midrabanan, how could one think that Chol HaMoed is an oath? And then he brings the Yerushalmi, which says explicitly this thing, because it says in the Yerushalmi, there's a statement in Yerushalmi in Moed Katan Perik Bet Halacha Gimel, which says as follows: Amar Rabbi Abba Bar Memel, Elu Hayali Misha Nimna Imi. Were there other Chachamim who would agree with me, and we could make a bedin and make such a psak? Hitarti Basar Bechol Lishkol Belitra, Hitarti Shiur Osim Melacha Bechol Oshem Moed. He mentions two things. We won't go into the first one. The second one, he says, if it were up to me, I would say it's mutar to do malacha and chol HaMoed. Why? He says, Klum asaru malacha b'chol Oshem Moed ela kadesh yu ochlim v'shotim v'osakim b'Torah. Did the Chachamim make the isur of doing malacha and chol HaMoed for any other reason other than that people should be free to eat, drink, and study Torah during Chol HaMoed? In other words, they shouldn't go to work and do what they normally do. That these days should be days that are off, that one is free to do something, to do other things. In other words, to study Torah. That was the whole purpose of making Melacha Asur on Chol HaMoed, says Rabbi Bar Mimel. In other words, it's not min HaTorah. The Chachamim said that it should be so that people would have time to study Torah on Chol HaMoed. And we see that people don't do this. Ve'inun achlin v'shatinu for hazin. And what people do is they eat, drink, and be merry, but they don't study Torah necessarily. So then why should they go to work? It's better they should go to work. That's what he says. That statement proves that the Yerushalmi holds, at least this Chacham in the Yerushalmi holds, and no one disagrees with him in the Yerushalmi, that the Yisur Malacha on Chol HaMoed is not min HaTorah, it's midrabanan. That's also, by the way, the view of the Rambam. The Rambam says in Perek Zayin, at the beginning, Rambam says as follows in Halacha Aleph: Hulo shel HaMoed, af al pi shelo ne'emar bo Shabbaton, even though the Torah doesn't call it a Shabbaton, in other words, a day when Malacha is asur. Ho'il v'nikra mikra kodesh, seeing that there is at least maybe one pasuk at least where you can understand it's also the word mikra kodesh also refers to these days of Chol HaMoed, even though normally, by the way, mikra kodesh dafka refers to Yom Tov. V'harei hu zman hagiga b'mikdash, and these are also days when one can bring the korban chagiga during all the days of Chol HaMoed. It doesn't have to be on Yom Tov. One can also bring it during Chol HaMoed. Therefore, these days are asur b'asiyat melacha, kedei shelo yeh keshar yemei hachol. So there shouldn't be like any other weekday. She'en bahem kedusha klal, which are just regular days. V'ha'oseh bo melacha ha'asura, and he who does things on Chol HaMoed that is asur to do, makin otho makaf maduth. He is to be lashed by the Beth Din, but it's midrabanan. Mipnei she'isuro midivrei sofarim. The Rambam says explicitly that it's so. This is also what the Radbaz suggested, that if one holds a melacha and Chol HaMoed is asur min HaTorah, then maybe one has a claim that, or maybe has more than maybe, that one has a claim that one should not wear tefillin on Chol HaMoed. But if one holds, as the Yerushalmi he holds explicitly, as the Rambam holds, that the Yisur Melacha is definitely Divrei Sofarim, then one really has no leg to stand on. The trouble is that the Ozarua, who was Chacham Atzum, and he knew the Bavli and Yerushalmi like we know Asher Sharefecha, he says there's a sugya in the Talmud Bavli from which he understood at least, and other Rishonim also, many other Rishonim also would agree, that sugya seems to imply at least quite strongly that Melacha and Chol HaMoed is based on something from the Torah. So that particular argument, he himself says, I take back what I said about Melacha on Chol HaMoed, but nevertheless he says, even whether Chol HaMoed is the Melacha on Chol HaMoed that's asur min HaTorah or not, wearing tefillin is not necessarily dependent on that question. In other words, one can still hold, and this is what the Ozarah holds, and other Rishonim also agree, and the Mishkan of Yaakov agrees, which is another posek from more recent times that we'll mention in the next year perhaps. He says, even if you claim that there is an Yisur Melacha of some type on Chol HaMoed, which is min HaTorah, that doesn't necessarily prove anything about wearing tefillin. One can believe there's an Yisur Melacha min HaTorah and still say one has to wear tefillin. And then he brings the Yerushalmi from Moed Katan, etc., and he brings a further Gemara from Masechet Beisah, and based on those Gemarot, he says his maskana is lamadnu shemutar lidbosh tefillin b'chol HaMoed. When he says mutar, it also means betzim chayav. In other words, there's a chovah to do so. So one does so. That's the maskana of the Ozarah. So that's another Rishon who holds that you do wear tefillin b'chol HaMoed. And there are others, but because of the late hour, I'm going to stop for now at this point. And we'll leave things here at this point for this evening. Next week we'll see some more sources, and we'll try and sum up this sugya. And because of the hour, and because I'm expecting some people to come, I won't take questions now either. All right. So I wish you all kol tov.
Thank you, Rabbi Bar-Hayim. We would like to encourage our viewers to share these videos with friends and send in your responses. We would also like to suggest the following opportunity to our viewers. If you identify with Rabbi Bar-Hayim's message and would like to sponsor or dedicate a video interview with the rabbi in honor or memory of a loved one, if you would like to obtain Birkon Nusach Eretz Yisrael or invite the rabbi for a speaking engagement, please email us at office@machonshilo.org.